What makes DeForest Buckner and Grover Stewart one of the best defensive line tandems in the NFL? Let's get to it.
You are Locked On Colts, your daily Indianapolis Colts podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, everybody. Thanks for tuning in and making us your first listen of the day. This is your daily podcast covering your Indianapolis Colts, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's show is brought to you by Birddogs. Go to birddogs.com/LockedOnNFL. And when you enter our promo code LockedOnNFL, they'll throw in a free custom Birddogs Yeti-style tumbler with every order. Because we all know we can't get enough of those cups. I have about 1,500 in my kitchen right now. We're welcoming more at all times. Anyways, I'm Jake Arthur. He is Zach Hicks. You know the two of us from horseshoehuddle.com. I am your boots on the ground there at the facility, the credentialed member of the media there for the site. Zach is just the resident, notorious baddest man in film study. And man, he's been giving you some good stuff lately. So that is us. On today's show, we're going to continue our position by position breakdown. And today we finally have gotten to the interior defensive line. This is a group, Zach, over the last few years, you know, Matt Eberflus into Gus Bradley, a lot of guys that can play in multiple spots. So we'll go ahead and, we'll go through the starters, the guys who are going to play key depth roles, and then the guys who might be fighting for a spot on the bubble. This is a group that has zero mystery when it comes to who the starters are. DeForest Buckner, the multi-time All-Pro, and Grover Stewart, one of the best nose tackles in the game. No one's threatening their spots, Zach. So Buckner and Stewart, we've seen them performing together at a very high level for a few years now. What's your expectations for 2023 in year two under Bradley and Nate Ollie?
Yeah, it's really interesting having this older-ish, like these guys aren't old players by any means, but they're getting close to their 30s. This like older dominant duo on a team that's so young and kind of retooling and rebuilding a little bit. It's like they're the only ones that are way ahead of the rebuild right now are those two guys. If the Colts win a game here and there, it's because these two are having phenomenal games, whether that's Grover Stewart shutting down the run, whether that's DeForest Buckner disrupting the pass. Two very, very good players. And expectations wise, I think it's just more of the same from both of them. It's DeForest Buckner getting around 10 sacks a season, being in the top 10 in pressures generated among defensive tackles in the NFL. And then Grover Stewart being one of the best in the league at, getting run stops, getting tackles for a loss, getting overall tackles in general for defensive tackle. I mean, Grover Stewart's been doing that for years. DeForest Buckner's been doing this for years. I mean, that's why the Colts traded a first-round pick for DeForest Buckner years ago. These are just two guys that are at the top of the game. I think Pro Football Network did a ranking back in March of the top 25 defensive tackles. It was our friend Dalton Miller over there who did it. And he had DeForest Buckner at 7th best in the NFL among all defensive tackles. And Grover Stewart, I believe, came in at 16 for him. So two very, very good defensive tackles that anyone who watches the game can understand the impact that both these players have. And even though Stewart doesn't really offer as much in the passing game, even though he's saying that he wants to be more this next season with that, even though he doesn't do that, he's so good at his confined role that it's fine. Like, he's still a positive player. If this were baseball, we'd be talking about him being a positive WAR player. He's adding those wins over replacement because he's so dominant in the run game and just affecting the game that way. So two of the best players on the team. I think honestly, if you were to rank out the best players on this entire Colts roster, they'd probably both be in the top 5. That's how important both these players are. Very, very good players, and I expect much of the same that we've seen the last couple seasons out of both of them.
That's where I'm at too, because they're both in their prime right now, so I don't see any like big leaps coming up. But they're also not at the point in their careers where they're going to start declining yet either. Stewart, like you said, you had mentioned it. He said he's always working on his pass rush. I think he had a career high 4 sacks last year, which for a nose tackle is pretty good. So he's probably going to try and increase that a little bit. Gus Bradley, someone mentioned it to him later that day, and he thought it was funny because he just knows that Grover doesn't ever want to leave the field. He's going to try and keep himself out there on passing downs. But no, these guys are great. They're interior defensive line play isn't always the sexiest thing on the field, but during training camp, they're two of the most entertaining guys to watch because they can just wreck a whole practice for the offense, just ruin everything they're trying to do. There are a couple guys who are so good and play at such a high level that they can just flip a switch and influence everything. You're like, oh yeah, these guys are kind of like crazy good. They can just do whatever they want. So they're really great to watch. And I think they're especially important for the young guys that the Colts have brought in that we're going to talk about here in a bit. And you could factor in Dio Dengbo into that too, even though he's a defensive end. He's someone who kicks inside and out. But they're really great. A question I had for you though is, as I find my light here, do you consider Buckner and Stewart to be the best interior line duo in the NFL, or they're at the very least among the best, would you say?
Yeah, I think I'd have them third. Or, I mean, it's close between the top three. I think the top three is pretty clear among anyone who kind of watches defensive tackles and defensive line play. The top three, I think, again, no order, but I would have the Colts third. But you guys, again, can rank these in any way. But Jonathan Allen, De'Aaron Payne are going to be up there. I mean, two phenomenal players that both offer a lot in the pass rush as well as the run game, where, again, Grover Stewart's been a little bit limited in his career. And then I think you have to have Dexter Lawrence and Leonard Williams there with the Giants up super high as well. Just because, again, Dexter Lawrence is a top 5 defensive tackle in football. And then Leonard Williams is another phenomenal pass rusher who maybe doesn't offer as much in the run game, but passing is obviously more important than the run game. So having another high level pass rusher is big, but I think Grover Stewart and DeForest Buckner are right up there. And one thing I want to add with this too is, when we're talking about the impact these two players have on the team and on the field play, off the field, these are two of the most, lovable personalities, two guys that everyone kind of just, the whole team kind of revolves around. Like, they are just huge personalities, team captain type guys that everyone looks up to. So it's such a big thing for a young team to have presences like that. Like Jonathan Taylor is a phenomenal player and a great player, and people look up to him, but you got to have the presence sometimes as a leader that a Grover Stewart has, or that a DeForest Buckner has, where it's like, they're not going to be super talkative. They're going to be explosive, but the second they walk into a room, everyone's looking at what they're doing because they've been doing it for so long. And they're just those type of guys. So I think guys like Taylor can learn to be leaders from those guys. I think guys like Zaire Franklin obviously has kind of gone the same way as them as well, where it's like they just have that energy about them on and off the field. So yeah, I mean, when you're looking for best overall players on the team and most important players to the team, I know you don't look at defensive tackles generally, but for the Colts, these are two of the top players on the team and two of the most important players for the Colts going forward and at the beginning of this kind of retooling or this rebuild or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, I recently did that thing where I had the Colts' most important players, and I cut it off at 3. But after I got out of those offensive players, I literally had them neck and neck as the 2 most important defensive players. Like, it just depends what you're looking for. And, the Colts have a pretty rough stretch of opposing running backs this year. So you look at someone like Stewart and how influential he is against the run. And, of course, Buckner is one of the best interior pass rushers in the league, and that's an invaluable trait in itself. So together, those two, like you said, number 3 is probably good, because those other duos are just really, really good. You can also do like Quentin Williams and Quentin Jefferson's a nice duo.
Yeah.
Aaron Donald and a bag of potatoes. Yeah. Like, that's a pretty good one. But no, there's a lot of really good duos in the league, but I think it really says something that they're probably top 3, top 4.
Yeah. Again, for a team that's kind of young and retooling and did not win many games whatsoever last year, outside of running back, like defensive tackle is probably the only position where you could look at and say, we have one of the best, or we have 2 of the best in the league. I guess left guard as well, obviously with Quentin Nelson. But outside of those positions, defensive tackle is the one where you can look at and be like, okay, this is where the Colts are the elite of the elite around the league. And you can be the most pessimistic fan ever, but you can't deny the impact that DeForest Buckner and Grover Stewart have on the field. I mean, the Colts last year, I think they were 30th in rushing yards allowed per game because teams were winning every game, like the whole game. So they were able to run the ball so much more, but they were still top 6 in rushing yards per like rushing yard average or whatever. So it was 4.1 yards per carry is what they allowed last year, which was sixth best in the league. So teams were running on them, knew they could run on them all game, and the Colts were still buckling it down and keeping that yards per carry down a little bit. I mean, that's just the impact these two players have, as well as having, the Colts were almost had their franchise record in sacks. Both those players contributed to that as well. So two top tier players that we really don't have to worry about whatsoever next season or the coming seasons after that.
Yeah, absolutely zero mystery to that group there. But next, the players that should be key to the Colts' interior depth behind Buckner and Stewart in 2023. But first, we're going to chat about our pals over at Birddogs. Fellas, I told you yesterday, it's skies out. That means the thighs are out. And Birddogs are going to make you look good in that department. Their stretch khaki shorts are designed to fit slimmer through the thigh and leg, giving you a truly sculpted look like the Greek gods that you all are. They fit way better than regular shorts, and they're not made of stiff, restricting cotton. They fixed the issue by inventing cloud knit fabric that looks just like khakis but stretches so that you get a way slimmer fit without having to sacrifice movement. Birddogs also uses an anti-stink sweat wicking fabric, which is a mouthful, that keeps you cool and dry all day long. And that's great because a lot of those materials that are like gym clothes materials that are supposed to wick moisture, they just make you stink, but Birddogs don't. So that's pretty clutch. Go to birddogs.com/lockedonnfl and enter our promo code LockedOnNFL for a free Yeti style tumbler with your order. That's birddogs.com/lockedonnfl for a free Yeti style tumbler. You won't want to take your Birddogs off. We promise you that much.
And everydayers, I know this has been kind of a weird and tough week for all of us when it comes to the Colts. We've been covering this Isaiah Rodgers situation as it's been going. So if you guys have missed that at all, please go back and check out our last couple episodes. We also had some quick hitters as well where we talked about it. So all you beautiful everydayers, if you happen to miss that, go back and check those out. All right, Jake. So we're talking about depth players behind the top two, and you kind of mentioned it in the first segment a little bit. It's a little weird talking depth behind the defensive tackle group because you have guys like Dio Dangbo and you have guys like Tyquan Lewis who are going to get snaps on the interior, but they're not really defensive tackles. They kind of get out there for pass rushing stuff or just in unique sets. So the defensive tackle depth could be anywhere from 3 players in total, to 5 players in total or 6 players in total. Like the Colts could go so much with this depending on what their edge depth looks like, how confident they feel putting Dio Dangbo back inside. But they have 2 explosive guys here that we're going to talk about. Taven Bryan was their big free agent signing. And then Addy, Jake, can you say the right pronunciation here? Because I don't want to say it. I want to actually get it down.
I've been working on it. I think it's Adetomi Adebore. Nope. Adetomi Adebore.
Yes, Adetomi Adebore. Yeah. There we go. It
still doesn't roll off the tongue yet. I'm usually really good with those style of names. It hasn't grabbed me yet.
It's a great name, though, because it bounces. It's got that flow with it. Adetome, Adebore. Like, it just bounces like that, which I really like there. But talking about these 2 players, they kind of are the similar type of mold. They're both extremely explosive. Like, I want to put as much emphasis as I can on this. We're going to bold what I'm saying here. We're going to underline it. We're going to italicize it. These are the 2 extremely explosive defensive tackles. You could see it in their 40 times at their combines. You could see it in their vertical jumps and their just explosive jumps and everything. These are 2 of the most athletic defensive tackles in football behind the 2 starters that the Colts have. It's all about what they can do with that athleticism, though. Taven Bryan, the whole reason why he's been a journeyman in the NFL is he's kind of just an explosive guy. That's really all he is here in the NFL. And then Adetome, I mean, he's just a rookie. That's the reason why he fell, though. He fell to round 4 because he's kind of just an explosive guy in college. So 2 very raw-ish guys. Like, it's hard to say Brian's still raw because he's had some production, but 2 raw-ish guys that at least offer a lot in the stunt and twist game, the stunt and twist with all that action up front. So I'm intrigued by both them, but I'm in a weird place with both these guys where I don't know if they're going to be productive this year, but they could be because people just don't move like that. Both these guys, nobody moves like that.
Yeah. And I mean, obviously Taven Bryan, he's been in the league a handful of years now. This is his 2nd or 3rd contract, I think. So, I mean, teams know what he is. So the Colts had to have had a plan coming into it. Maybe they feel he's really fits in well to this attack front. They are going to use that athleticism and explosion to their advantage. You don't have to be ultra strong and do this and that. Like, just go try and get into the backfield, probably. Right. And the same thing with Ade. He's still listed as a defensive end actually on the team's roster. But I think he's even said that they're thinking 3 tech. So
yeah,
that's my guess, is he's going to be basically the inverse of Dio, where Dio is mostly an end that can kick inside. I think he's going to be, a defensive tackle that can occasionally go outside too. And just depending on whatever the situation, passing down, rushing down, what have you. But no, I mean, I think as far as you're looking at the depth goes, I think Ade is obviously safe, but Brian feels the safest of these depth guys. I think they should both probably make it. But like you said, Taekwon and Dio factor in as well. And we've seen in the past, they'll take those numbers into account. They're not necessarily going to keep a bunch of true defensive tackles if they've got a couple guys that can move from inside to out. So yeah, I think that'll be a big factor as well. You're probably not expecting much growth from Brian at this point.
Yeah.
But Adatome, you've got to expect to see a pretty significant jump from training camp through the end of the season.
Yeah, I think what's going to be fascinating with both these guys is I think we're both in agreement here where these are probably the next 2 guys up. If both of DeForest Buckner and Grover Stewart are off like in training camp or in preseason, these are going to be the 2 guys that come in. There's not really a 1 tech with these 2 guys though, or a nose tackle. Neither of these guys are that. Like Taven Bryan, ideal, like, he's 300 pounds. He's extremely explosive. He can get low on guys. Like, ideally he could be that, but he's never been that in his career. He's never been a good run defender. He's never been a guy that can 2 gap and eat blocks and be comfortable inside in that role. And Adatome, he's coming from defensive end to play 3 tech. He's not going to be a guy who from day one can go in and play 1 tech or something, or play nose tackle and withstand that kind of punishment. So when we're looking at roles behind the top 2 guys, who's Grover Stewart's backup? Is it one of these 2 guys? Because it's definitely not Adatome. Is it Taven Bryan though? Like, maybe if you're really just so committed to rushing the passer and Grover Stewart never coming off the field in run defense, then you're fine. But I think when we're looking at these 2 guys, the next man up, which I agree with you, I do think that these are the logical guys that come in afterwards. Do you feel comfortable enough with Taven Bryan as the backup nose tackle? Personally, I don't love it. We're going to talk about a guy in segment 3 who I think has a clear way to make the roster because of that. But it'll be interesting to see because again, I've had to say this a couple times now, but I do think these are the next 2 guys up. It's just who takes that Grover Stewart role on the second team.
Yeah, exactly. Because last year it didn't seem like there was a terrific plan there. I mean, they had some guys that could, feasibly do it, but yeah, like you said, these 2 guys are way more the 3 tech type. And they seem the safest to make it, but then the guys we're going to touch on in segment 3, we're probably looking at one of them that makes it on to the final one. So next up, who are those final players that are going to be fighting for maybe the last roster spot? Okay, Zach. So we've got a 4-way tie, I guess you could. Well, maybe not so much a tie. There's 2 guys that are definitely ahead above the rest. So you've got McTelvin, a Jim.
I think it's a Jim. McTelvin, a Jim. Texas A&M, former Texas A&M guy. I think he was an undrafted free agent or a late round pick of the Broncos.
I was going to say, I just now realized I've only ever seen his name spelled out. I've never actually heard it until I just had to say it. And then Eric Johnson, who was a day 3 pick for the Colts last year, who is a really big athletic guy they like for the nose tackle spot, but he was just there last year. Like, I thought in the summer he had some moments where he looked really explosive, really powerful, but when the season came, he was just out there. And then a couple undrafted rookies, Caleb Sampson from Kansas and Jamal Woods from Illinois. So Jim and Johnson are probably the guys fighting for that final spot.
Yeah. And I think Eric Johnson is going to have a phenomenal opportunity because, again, just off of my understanding of Taven Bryan's career and from watching him, I don't see him as a guy that's going to really wrap up that backup nose tackle position. I don't think he's going to be a lock to do it. Again, he might show some good things with his explosion and stuff like that in camp, but for the most part, I don't think he's going to be someone where you come out of camp being like, okay, we have our backup nose tackle. Eric Johnson, though, they've had on this development plan. They want to make him with a horrible comparison here. They want to make him the next Grover Stewart. Obviously it's impossible to find another Grover Stewart, but they want to have him on that same development plan where, year one, you're just kind of getting your feet wet, getting out there a little bit. And then going into your next season, it's getting that weight where it needs to be, getting your endurance and your stamina where it needs to be, and getting you ready to be a key rotational player. And then after that, we see what happens. Maybe you become a Grover Stewart, or maybe you just become a very solid player like an Al Woods or something in the past. I think that's what they are kind of envisioning with an Eric Johnson type thing. It's like, okay, year one, we got him on the field a little bit. We had him in the organization. He was always on the roster. Now it's all about getting him where he needs to be to where he can be an impactful player. Because if you look at this entire roster, obviously Caleb Sampson and Jamal Woods, they can be one tech type guys, but you're asking a lot out of undrafted free agents. If you're looking at the guys who have feasible shots at making it, Eric Johnson's the next best option behind Grover Stewart at one tech. He's got the size, he's got the explosion, he's got the power, he's got the strength, and he's got some experience last year under his belt as well. So it's really big opportunity for him to come into camp exactly where they want him to be and just feast on these third team reps, or if he gets some second team reps, or just feast on those reps and show that he can be a really good run defender. The big thing for him this whole camp is like, it'd be great to show that you can rush the passer, and it's great that you can get after the quarterback, but show that you can two gap, show that you can eat blocks, show that you can make things easier for linebackers there on that second and third team, because that'll be how he makes the roster. It's not making the roster getting 30 sacks a season, because that's not going to happen. He's going to make the roster by holding teams rushing yards down, by getting in the way, eating up blocks. That's exactly what he needs to do this camp. So he is the ultimate X factor in this group. If we're talking just from top to bottom in this defense tackle group, guys that can come out of seemingly nowhere to make the roster, or coming out of the bottom to make the roster, it's going to be Eric Johnson, because that role is so much up for grabs behind Grover Stewart.
Yeah, I think so. And whereas Ade is that X factor when it comes to getting that spot, because he can go inside and out, and maybe he jumps to the DT3 role. Johnson himself is a big one as well, because I mentioned he was just kind of there last year, but as you said, expectations probably weren't very high either. Kind of a getting your feet wet type of thing. And they did mention him in the same breath of molding him into that Grover Stewart type. They said that last year after they drafted him. He's definitely more of the one gap, the nose type of player. So yeah, they're both, that 6'3", 300 plus. They're not huge. They're not Grover Stewart size. But for a defensive front like this, that's the kind of size they're offering. Johnson is, for a guy with those measurables, very, very explosive. So I'm going to guess they're betting on those high-end traits. And if I had to give it to one of those guys, Johnson is probably the way to go. Again, they've made this investment in a guy from Missouri State. So they're going to give him a little time to acclimate and see what he can do.
Yeah, let me not ruin your headline here. Adetomi is the biggest X factor for the future in this group. Like, Adetomi might not play a snap this year. Like, it wouldn't shock me if Taven Bryan's the backup 3 tech, Eric Johnson's the backup 1 tech, and Adetomi is just a healthy scratch for most of the season. But it's not really about this season for him. It's about the next season and going forward and what he can be. I mean, we're talking about a guy who is 290 pounds, who's running a 4.4. Like, there's some potential there to develop. But for this next season, and most important guys in the depth group, it's going to be Eric Johnson, because if something happens to Grover Stewart, this run defense is going to allow 6 yards to carry. Like, it is going to be atrocious unless Eric Johnson can show that he can be a capable run stuffer. I'm not saying that the drop off between him and Grover Stewart needs to be like nothing at all, but at least get it up to a level where, last year, every time Grover Stewart came off the field on rundowns, we were like, oh no, Byron Cowart's not going to stop the run here. He's not going to eat blocks. He's going to get driven back. Eric Johnson last year was not that either. So we just want to see him get to a point where, again, like where Grover Stewart was back in 2019, I think, or whatever. So right before he kind of broke out is where, like, oh, Grover Stewart's in the game. that's good. Like that's a good rotational player who's making things happen. It's nothing like, oh, this is an elite player. It's okay, cool. Like he's holding down the fort. He's making some plays every now and then. That's just where Eric Johnson needs to be to make the roster. So I'm excited for him. I hope he can take that next step and hopefully get on that Grover Stewart development path there. But I did want to touch on McTelvin at Jim because I did cover him a little bit with the Broncos. I covered the Broncos for a very small amount of time last year, whatever it was, or 2 years ago. And yeah, he's an explosive player. He kind of fits the Taven Bryan and Adetome kind of role where it's super explosive, super strong, can get in there and shoot gaps really well. And if something were to happen to Taven Bryan or Adetome is just not ready and you feel more comfortable with the gym, like he's just another guy in that mold. So you could tell just from looking at this defensive tackle group that the most important thing to be a defensive tackle for the Colts is explosion. Like it is all explosion. All these guys are super athletes for their size, and it's going to be really fun to see what they can do in camp with the stunts and twists, with just gap shooting and getting into the backfield. This group is really fun on paper, even if it's not like obviously the top two guys are great, but even though it's not like this elite, everyone's a superstar group, it's okay. We have our top two guys who are really good, and then we just have athletes, just all athletes behind them, and we're going to see what they can do. So that's always fun to see for a team.
Yeah, I think, obviously they want the athletic types, and they're going to iron out the creases and, let them develop, how to counter and fight hands and things like that. They'll let you be explosive and see what you can do. They'll teach the intricacies after. But I was going to say, we need our Curtis Brooks this year. Because, when we started this show last summer, Curtis Brooks, had the naming rights to the show, basically. So whether it's Johnson or even like Sampson or Woods, we need our Curtis Brooks this year.
Do we need a Curtis Brooks in the defensive tackle group, though? Because we're kind of 0 for 1 on that one.
Probably, yeah.
We need our Sterling Weatherford.
Okay.
We need our next Sterling Weatherford, because that one also didn't go super well.
Hey, he had his moments.
Okay, to be fair, last year, though, we were high on Kylan Granson, and he had a solid seat. Like, for all things considered with the Colts offense, he was mostly fine. Like,
yeah, it wasn't his fault how things went.
Right. Well, we'll find someone. We'll find some guys that we enjoy. We got the cornerback group coming up soon, and we'll have a lot of corners in that group. I'm sure we'll be just like the entire Colts fan base and be on Darius Rush. Yeah.
So far, so good. And I feel like you plugged that on purpose, because Zach just actually put out Wednesday afternoon a piece on Darius Rush. So after this, in a couple minutes when we're off, you go to horseshoehuddle.com and you check that piece out.
Look at that. We're of the same mindset there. We're on the same mindset. But that's all we have for today, guys. Again, this defensive tackle group, very, very top heavy and very athlete heavy behind them. So it's going to be really fun to watch them in camp. And everydayers, this is it for us this week. Make sure to come back next week as we continue through this preview of the entire roster and going through all the players. We have added some addendums to other episodes, like Brashad Perriman episode, or with the wide receiver episode. We're going to put Brashad Perriman in the show notes and everything like that, just to add some more context if you guys are listening to those a little bit later, when the Colts have added players at those positions. So everydayers, make sure you're checking back on those episodes and looking forward to next week's episodes as we get closer and closer to finishing off this roster. And if you guys don't already, follow at Locked On Colts, at Jake Arthur NFL, and at Zach Hicks 2, all on Twitter. Also, subscribe to the Locked On Colts podcast on YouTube, wherever you listen to your podcasts. We love your guys' ratings and reviews, and we'll see you guys bright and early next week.